The safety of the almost 40-year-old Koeberg nuclear power station in the Western Cape is once again being questioned. This comes as Eskom is planning to extend the operating life of the power utility for another 20 years.
Let's talk to you straight, because what just happened in Africa deserves your full attention. While the world keeps lecturing Africa about energy insecurity and poor infrastructure, something historic just unfolded quietly on the southern edge of the continent. South Africa's Koeberg nuclear power plant, the only operational nuclear facility in all of Africa, has officially secured a 20-year license extension, guaranteeing clean, stable power all the way to 2045. No global announcement, no Western applause, just Africans proving they can operate some of the most complex infrastructure on Earth with precision and long-term discipline.
The phrase nuclear superpower has a particular weight in global affairs. It is a term associated with secrecy, restraint, and decades of carefully managed international agreements. For that reason alone, the idea that an entire continent could move closer to such a status overnight has triggered anxiety, disbelief, and urgent diplomatic conversations far beyond Africa itself. Yet in recent months, a series of developments, each unremarkable on its own, have begun to converge in ways that have startled analysts in Washington, Brussels, and parts of Asia. None of these developments amount to the creation of nuclear weapons, and no African country has announced such an intention. But taken together, they point to something far more subtle and, in some ways, more consequential: Africa's accelerating mastery of nuclear-adjacent capabilities, resources, and partnerships that were once firmly controlled by a small group of global powers. At the heart of the concern is uranium. Africa already holds an estimated 30% of the world's known uranium reserves, with significant deposits in Niger, Namibia, South Africa, and Malawi. For decades, much of this uranium has been exported in raw or semi-processed form to fuel reactors in Europe, North America, and Asia. Control over pricing, processing, and downstream technology largely remained elsewhere. What has changed is not the existence of these resources, but the speed at which African governments are now moving to retain more of the value chain. Several countries have announced plans to expand domestic processing, invest in nuclear science education, and renegotiate long-standing extraction contracts. These moves are framed publicly as energy security measures, aimed at addressing chronic electricity shortages and reducing reliance on fossil fuels. At the same time, Africa's demand for power is soaring. The continent's population is young, urbanizing rapidly, and increasingly connected. Renewable energy has expanded quickly, but intermittency and infrastructure gaps remain major challenges. For a growing number of policymakers, civilian nuclear energy is no longer taboo. It is being discussed openly as one option among many. South Africa, the only African country to have ever developed nuclear weapons, and to voluntarily dismantle them, has long operated a civilian nuclear program under international safeguards. In recent years, it has quietly expanded its research capacity and re-engaged international partners on reactor modernization and skills training. Elsewhere, countries with no nuclear history are beginning from scratch, signing cooperation agreements focused on medicine, agriculture, and power generation. These agreements are legal, transparent, and subject to international oversight. But they are also reshaping perceptions. For decades, nuclear expertise was concentrated in a narrow club of states. Today, knowledge flows more freely, and training programs are increasingly global. African scientists are studying nuclear engineering abroad and returning home with skills that were once rare on the continent. What has unsettled Western capitals is not a single announcement, but the pace of accumulation. Uranium reserves, trained personnel, research reactors, regional cooperation frameworks, and new diplomatic alignments are emerging almost simultaneously. To intelligence analysts accustomed to linear change, it feels abrupt. There is also a geopolitical layer. Africa's international partnerships are more diversified than at any point since independence. China and Russia have been especially active in offering nuclear cooperation agreements that emphasize infrastructure development and technology transfer. These partnerships are presented as alternatives to models that African leaders say left their countries dependent rather than empowered. Western officials stress that all such cooperation must comply with non-proliferation rules, and there is no public evidence that these rules are being violated. Nonetheless, the symbolism matters. Influence in the nuclear sector has always been as much about prestige and leverage as about hardware. The phrase overnight is, of course, misleading. None of this happened in a single day. But from the outside, The cumulative effect has been sudden. Policies debated quietly for years are now being implemented almost simultaneously across multiple countries. What once seemed theoretical is becoming operational. It is also important to separate fear from fact. Africa has no unified nuclear command, no shared weapons program, and no indication of intent to pursue nuclear arms. The African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty, known as the Treaty of Palindaba, remains in force and is a point of pride for many governments. The continent's historical experience with colonialism and Cold War proxy conflicts has made many leaders deeply wary of weapons of mass destruction. Still, the conversation has shifted. African diplomats speak more confidently about technological sovereignty. Energy ministers frame nuclear expertise as a development tool, not a security threat. Scientists argue that excluding Africa from advanced technology in the name of safety perpetuates inequality. From Washington's perspective, this raises complex questions. The United States has long supported non-proliferation while also benefiting from global nuclear commerce. It now faces a world in which influence is less automatic, and partnerships must compete on terms set by African capitals themselves. European governments find themselves in a similar position. Many depend on African uranium, while simultaneously expressing concern about Africa's technological advancement. This tension is not lost on African negotiators, who increasingly point out the contradiction. Public reaction within Africa is far from uniform. Some see nuclear development as a symbol of progress and dignity. Others worry about costs, governance, and environmental risk. Civil society groups stress the need for transparency and accountability, reminding governments that nuclear projects demand long-term institutional strength. The media framing of Africa as a potential nuclear superpower has also drawn criticism. Experts caution that such language can be sensational and misleading, reinforcing stereotypes rather than encouraging informed debate. Power, they argue, is not only measured in weapons, but in the ability to set agendas and negotiate as equals. And yet, words matter because perceptions shape policy. If global powers begin to treat Africa as a latent nuclear actor rather than a passive supplier of raw materials, diplomatic behavior will change. Investment decisions, security partnerships, and even aid priorities could be recalibrated. What is perhaps most striking is how little of this story is driven by confrontation. There has been no dramatic announcement, no defiant speech, no test or threat. Instead, there has been a quiet accumulation of capability, knowledge, and confidence. In a world accustomed to loud signals, this subtlety has been disorienting. For African leaders, the message is simple. They argue that the continent can no longer be expected to supply the inputs of modern civilization without mastering its technologies. They insist that development and responsibility are not mutually exclusive. For the rest of the world, the challenge is adjustment. A multipolar nuclear landscape does not necessarily mean a more dangerous one, but it does demand new habits of engagement. Old assumptions about who holds expertise and who must be supervised are increasingly untenable. Whether Africa ever approaches anything resembling nuclear superpower status in the conventional sense remains highly unlikely and, by most accounts, undesirable. But the deeper shift is already underway. Africa is asserting itself not as an object of nuclear policy, but as a participant in shaping how advanced technology is governed, shared, and used. In that sense, the real story is not about weapons, but about agency. The unease in Western capitals reflects a broader recognition that the global order is changing in ways that are harder to predict and harder to control. What happens next will depend on choices made in African capitals, and on whether the rest of the world responds with cooperation or suspicion. History suggests that inclusion fosters stability, while exclusion breeds resentment. Africa's nuclear moment, if it can be called that, is less a sudden leap than a long-delayed arrival. And like many arrivals, it is prompting the world to take notice, rethink assumptions, and prepare for a future that no longer looks quite as familiar as it once did.